Prince Harry, the Duke of Sussex, fifth in line to the throne, walking into a British courtroom, again not as a witness this time, not as a bystander, but as a litigant, a plaintiff, a man who has made the British legal system his personal therapist, his complaint department, and his stage, 5 appeals, 5 and every single one of them denied. Now I want you to hold that number in your mind, 5, because we're going to come back to it. We're going to unpack what those 5 appeals represent, what they cost, what they reveal, and most importantly, what they tell us about the breathtaking trajectory of a man who once had everything the British establishment could offer, and who now finds himself locked out of its corridors, knocking on doors that no longer open for him. But here's the part of this story that elevates it from royal soap opera to genuine constitutional crisis. While Harry was collecting legal defeats like some people collect parking tickets, something far more consequential was happening in Westminster. Members of Parliament, elected representatives of the British people, were doing something that hasn't been done in modern memory. They were demanding the removal of royal titles, not suggesting, not hinting, not whispering it over drinks at the members' bar, demanding. And if you think that's just political theatre, I would encourage you to pay very, very close attention to what follows. Because this story is not about Harry anymore. Not really. This story is about what happens when the monarchy, the oldest continuous institution in the Western world, collides with modern celebrity culture, American-style grievance politics, and a woman from Montecito, California, who seems to believe that the rules apply to absolutely everyone except her. To understand where we are, we need to understand how we got here. Harry's legal adventures in the United Kingdom have been, by any reasonable measure, extraordinary. Not extraordinary in the sense of being impressive. Extraordinary in the sense that no member of the royal family in living memory has engaged in such a sustained, public, and ultimately self-defeating campaign of litigation against British institutions. Let's walk through what happened. Harry's legal team mounted 5 separate appeals across his various cases involving the British press. Now, for those unfamiliar with the British legal system, an appeal is not simply asking for a do-over because you didn't like the result. An appeal requires demonstrating that the original court made an error of law. It is a serious legal mechanism, and it is treated seriously by serious courts. 5 times, Harry's legal team argued that errors had been made. 5 times they presented their case. And 5 times, with the kind of methodical, unsparing precision that the British judiciary is known for, those appeals were rejected, denied, dismissed, refused. Now I want to be fair here. Losing an appeal does not necessarily mean your original case was without merit. The legal system is complex and reasonable legal minds can disagree, but 5 for 5, at some point, the pattern stops being bad luck and starts being a message. And the message from the British courts is remarkably clear. We have heard you, we have considered your arguments, and we have found them wanting. But what's particularly striking, and this is where the story takes on a dimension that goes beyond legal technicalities, is the reaction from the Sussex camp. Silence, graceful acceptance, a dignified acknowledgement that the courts have spoken. No. What we got instead was a carefully orchestrated media response, designed to reframe 5 consecutive legal defeats as somehow evidence of a broken system. The implication being, of course, that the system isn't delivering the right results because the system itself is corrupt. Does that rhetorical strategy sound familiar to anyone? It should. It's the same playbook that has been deployed from Montecito for the past 4 years. Every setback is proof of conspiracy. Every closed door is evidence of persecution. Every no is really just confirmation that the forces of darkness are aligned against them. It is, when you strip away the royal titles and the Netflix deals and the RTL letterhead, the argumentation style of someone who has never been told no in a way they were willing to accept. And I think we all know who in that particular partnership has elevated the refusal to accept no into something approaching an art form now. Let's turn to Westminster. Because this is where the story stops being a celebrity drama and starts being something genuinely significant. members of Parliament have begun publicly calling for the removal of the Sussexes' royal titles. And I want to be precise about what this means, because precision matters when we're talking about constitutional machinery. The titles Duke and Duchess of Sussex were granted by the Queen, Her late Majesty Elizabeth II, on the occasion of Harry and Meghan's wedding. They are, in the most literal sense, a gift from the Crown. And there is a growing sentiment among elected representatives that this gift has been not only squandered, but actively weaponized against the institution that bestowed it. Let's be honest about what's driving this. It is not, despite what certain commentators in Los Angeles might suggest, racism. It is not jealousy. It is not some archaic establishment closing ranks against outsiders. It is exhaustion. The British public, and by extension their elected representatives, are exhausted by the relentless performative grievance that has emanated from the Sussex household since approximately 37 seconds after the wedding cake was cut. Think about what the British people have endured from this couple in the last 5 years alone. A sit-down interview with Oprah Winfrey in which the royal family was accused, on global television, to an audience of tens of millions, of racism, cruelty, and institutional neglect. A Netflix documentary series that presented a meticulously curated victim narrative while simultaneously monetizing every private moment they claimed was being violated. A memoir, and I use that term generously, in which Prince Harry described private family conversations, military service anecdotes of questionable taste, and personal details that would make even the most shameless reality television producer wince. And through all of it, every interview, every documentary episode, every ghostwritten chapter, those titles, Duke and Duchess of Sussex, printed on every press release, embossed on every piece of RTL correspondence, deployed in every business negotiation as a silent guarantee of royal legitimacy. The titles are not incidental to the Sussex brand. They are the Sussex brand. Without them, Harry is a retired military officer with a complicated family and a residence in California. Without them, Meghan is a former television actress from a show that, with the greatest respect, most British people had never heard of before 2016. The titles are the currency. And the MPs who are now demanding their removal understand this perfectly, and this brings us, inevitably, to the figure at the center of this entire saga. The person without whom none of this, not the lawsuits, not the interviews, not the Netflix deals, not the jam brands, not the lifestyle websites, not the podcast deals that produce almost no podcasts, none of it would have happened. Meghan Markle, the Duchess of Sussex. Now I want to be careful here. Criticism of Meghan Markle has become, in certain circles, something approaching a forbidden act. Any critical examination of her behavior, her decisions, or her influence is immediately reframed as an attack motivated by prejudice. This is, of course, a remarkably convenient shield. It means that she operates in a space where normal scrutiny, the kind of scrutiny that every public figure endures, is preemptively delegitimized. But scrutiny is exactly what's required. Because the evidence of the last 5 years tells a very particular story, and it is not the story that the Sussex PR machine would like you to believe. Let's start with the Oprah interview, because it remains the defining text of the Sussex era. In that interview, Meghan made a series of claims that were, to put it diplomatically, contested. The claim about being married 3 days before the official wedding, later corrected. The claim about Kate making her cry versus the other way around, contradicted by multiple sources. The claim about a family member expressing concern about the color of their unborn child's skin. A claim so explosive, so incendiary, that it dominated global headlines for weeks, and yet one for which no evidence has ever been produced, no context has ever been provided, and no specific individual has ever been named. That last point deserves emphasis. If someone in your family made a racist comment about your child, and you decided to share that fact with the entire world on television, you would presumably be willing to identify who said it. You would want accountability. You would want the record to be clear. Unless, of course, the ambiguity is the point. unless the power of the accusation lies precisely in its vagueness, in the way it casts suspicion over an entire institution without requiring the accuser to substantiate, specify, or defend the claim. That is not the behavior of someone seeking justice. That is the behavior of someone deploying a weapon, and it worked. Spectacularly, the royal family was put on the defensive globally. The institution that had survived world wars, abdication crises, and centuries of political upheaval was genuinely rocked by a single television interview conducted from a garden in Santa Barbara. You have to admire the efficiency, even as you recall from the ethics, but here's what I find most revealing about the entire Sussex project, and it's something that doesn't get discussed enough. Look at the pattern. Not the individual events, but the pattern. Every relationship Meghan Markle has had with an institution or a family has followed the same arc. Entry, enthusiasm, escalation, estrangement, accusation, her relationship with her own family, her first marriage, her friendship circles in Toronto. The royal family, even her professional relationships, look at the trail of departed staff members, the revolving door of advisors, the pattern of partnerships that begin with fanfare and end with silence. At some point, a reasonable person asks the question, if everywhere you go you leave behind burned bridges and broken relationships, is it possible, just possible, that the common denominator is not the bridges? Now, I'm not a psychologist. I'm not qualified to diagnose anyone. But I am a commentator, and I am qualified to observe patterns. And the pattern here is not subtle. It is, in fact, screaming. Every institution that Meghan Markle has been part of has been diminished by her departure from it, not enhanced, diminished. The royal family's approval ratings took a hit not because Harry left, but because of how he left and what was said on the way out. Netflix and Spotify invested hundreds of millions of dollars in Sussex content, and received, by any industry measure, a deeply disappointing return. Spotify famously or infamously parted ways with the couple, with one executive reportedly describing them as, and I quote, grifters. Grifters, that's not my word. That's the word used by someone who was paying them tens of millions of dollars. Let that sink in for a moment. The people writing the checks, the people who had every financial incentive to believe in the Sussex brand, looked at what they were getting and reached for that particular word. Not disappointed, not underperforming. Grifters, when the people paying you tens of millions of dollars describe you using the vocabulary of a fraud investigation, it is reasonable to conclude that the arrangement has not gone well. But of course, from the Sussex perspective, this too was someone else's fault. The streaming landscape changed, the market shifted, creative differences emerged. There is always an explanation, always a context, always a reason why the outcome was not their responsibility. This is, I would suggest, the defining characteristic of the Meghan Markle operation. Nothing is ever her fault. Every failure has an external cause. Every broken relationship was broken by the other party. Every disappointed investor simply failed to understand the vision. It is a masterclass in the externalization of accountability, delivered with a smile warm enough to melt ice and eyes expressive enough to suggest that she, alone among all of us, truly feels things deeply. Let's return to Westminster, because the parliamentary dimension of this story is where it becomes truly consequential. The calls to strip the Sussex titles are not merely symbolic. They represent a genuine constitutional conversation about the limits of royal privilege and the obligations that come with royal status. Here is the fundamental question that MPs are now grappling with. Can an individual retain the titles, privileges, and constitutional status of a member of the royal family, while simultaneously conducting a public campaign against that family and the institution it represents? The answer, according to a growing number of parliamentarians, is no. And they have precedent on their side. The Titles Deprivation Act of 1917 provides a mechanism for removing titles from individuals who have, in essence, acted against the interests of the Crown. Now, that act was designed for a very specific historical context, enemy peers during the First World War, but the principle it establishes is relevant. Titles are not unconditional, they carry expectations. And when those expectations are violated, the titles can be withdrawn. The question is whether the political will exists to act. And this is where Harry's legal misadventures become relevant again. Because every failed lawsuit, every denied appeal, every courtroom defeat chips away at the narrative of victimhood that the Sussexes have constructed. It becomes harder to argue that you are being persecuted by a system when that system has given you 5 separate opportunities to make your case and found against you each time. The courts have spoken. The public has largely made up its mind, and now Parliament is beginning to stir. There is also a financial dimension to the title question that rarely gets the attention it deserves. The Sussex brand, the commercial enterprise built around 2 people who claim to have left royal life for privacy and freedom, derives its entire value from the royal connection. Every speaking engagement, every book deal, every brand partnership, every Netflix commission is predicated on the implicit promise of royal access and royal authenticity. Remove the titles and the proposition collapses. Not immediately, perhaps, not overnight. But the foundation crumbles, and everything built on top of it follows. This is why the title question is not merely symbolic, it is existential. And this is why the Sussex response to parliamentary scrutiny has been so carefully managed, so precisely calibrated to avoid direct engagement with the substance of what is being proposed, because there is no good answer to the question. There is no argument that simultaneously justifies retaining the titles while continuing the current behavior. You cannot be a working royal and a Netflix producer. You cannot be a servant of the crown and its most prominent critic. You cannot have it both ways, and yet for 5 years that is precisely what has been attempted, and yet here he is. Harry is back in Britain, walking the streets of a country whose institutions he has publicly attacked, whose press he has sued, whose family he has exposed, and whose people he has, in the estimation of many, betrayed. Why, that's the question, isn't it? Why does he keep coming back? Some will say it's the legal cases. He has to be present for certain proceedings. That's true as far as it goes. But there's something else at work here, something that Harry himself may not fully understand. He comes back because Britain is home. Because despite the mansion in Montecito and the California sunshine and the celebrity friends and the podcast deals, this grey, complicated, infuriating country is where he belongs. Knows it, we know it. And somewhere in that sprawling estate in Santa Barbara, surrounded by the wreckage of yet another business venture, I suspect Meghan knows it too. And that, more than any court ruling or parliamentary motion, may be the thing that frightens her most. Because Meghan's entire project, the brand, the image, the narrative, depends on Harry being permanently estranged from his family and his country. The moment he reconciles, the moment he comes home, the entire edifice collapses. Without Harry's grievance, Meghan has no story. Without his royal connection, she has no brand. Without his family's dysfunction, she has no content. She needs him angry. She needs him isolated. She needs him at war with the people who love him most. And the British public, watching this slow-motion tragedy unfold, is beginning to say, enough. There is a particular kind of sadness in watching a man of genuine courage. And whatever you think of Harry's choices, his military service was real, and his bravery in combat was documented, being reduced to a supporting character in someone else's brand strategy. A man who once served his country, who carried the weight of royal expectation with more grace than he is given credit for, who lost his mother in the most public and devastating way imaginable, reduced to a prop. A duke in name, a pawn in practice. The British people have not stopped caring about Harry. They have stopped believing that what surrounds him serves his interests. And that distinction matters enormously. 5 appeals denied, parliamentary motions tabled, public patience exhausted. This is what a reckoning looks like. Not dramatic, not cinematic, but slow, methodical, and irreversible. The British establishment does not act quickly. It never has. It absorbed the Reformation, survived the Civil War, weathered 2 world wars, and navigated the end of empire with a combination of patience, pragmatism, and an almost supernatural ability to wait out its opponents. And it is waiting out the Sussexes now. Every Denneed appeal tightens the vice. Every parliamentary question applies pressure. Every failed business venture erodes the financial foundation that sustains the Sussex lifestyle. Every passing month makes it harder to maintain the fiction that they are victims rather than architects of their own isolation. The British public is not cruel, but it is fair, and it has reached a conclusion that no amount of PR, no number of magazine covers, and no quantity of carefully staged paparazzi photographs can reverse. The conclusion is this: Meghan Markle took a prince, isolated him from his family, monetized his pain, weaponized his grievances, and built a brand on the wreckage of one of the most important families in the world. And she did it all while smiling for the cameras, talking about compassion and selling jam. That's the story. That's what the British people see. And that is why MPs are standing up in Westminster and saying what millions have been thinking for years. It's time for the titles to appeals. All Denneed, there's a metaphor in there somewhere. 5 chances to make your case. 5 opportunities to persuade a system that bends over backwards to be fair. And 5 times the answer came back the same. No, not because the system is broken. Not because dark forces are conspiring. Not because of racism or jealousy or any of the other explanations that have been offered from that house in California. Because sometimes, and I know this is a radical concept in the age of perpetual victimhood, sometimes you're just wrong. Sometimes the family you accused wasn't the villain. Sometimes the country you left behind wasn't your enemy. Sometimes the institution you attacked was actually trying to help you. And sometimes the person you married, the person who told you that everyone else was the problem, the person who encouraged you to burn every bridge and sue every newspaper and write every bitter word. Every time you think you have mapped the outer boundaries of this particular story, every time you think you understand the full dimensions of what is happening, something new emerges that expands those boundaries further. Something that makes you revise your assessment, recalibrate your expectations, and ask yourself the question you keep returning to no matter how many times you try to leave it behind. How did it come to this? How does a man with Harry's advantages, Harry's connections, Harry's institutional support, Harry's public goodwill, how does that man end up here? 5 legal appeals, all Denneed, his titles under parliamentary scrutiny, his family estranged, his business ventures collapsing, his credibility in his home country reduced to something approaching vapor. How does that happen? I will tell you how it happens. It happens 1 degree of separation at a time. It happens through a gradual process of isolation, so skillfully executed that the person being isolated rarely notices until the isolation is complete. It happens when someone who claims to love you systematically removes every other source of love from your life, leaving themselves as the only remaining option. It happens, in other words, exactly the way it has happened to Harry. Let us talk about the 5 appeals, because they matter more than the headlines suggest. The coverage of Harry's legal defeats has focused, understandably, on the immediate outcomes. He lost, the courts ruled against him, his arguments were rejected. These are facts, and they are significant facts, but what has received considerably less attention is what those 5 appeals collectively represent in terms of a strategic calculation. Because you don't file 5 separate appeals by accident. You don't pursue 5 separate rounds of litigation without a theory, without a plan. Without someone somewhere having decided that this approach was the right one. And I want you to ask yourself, who in the Sussex household is the strategic mind? Who is the one with the plan? Who is the one who looks at every situation and asks not what is right, but what is advantageous? Because it is not Harry. Harry has many qualities. Strategic patience is not traditionally counted among them. Harry is, by all accounts from people who know him well, impulsive, emotional, and deeply susceptible to the influence of those closest to him. These are not criticisms. These are human characteristics. But they are characteristics that make a person vulnerable in particular ways. They make a person vulnerable to someone who is strategic where they are impulsive, calculating where they are emotional, persistent where they are susceptible. 5 appeals were filed because someone decided they should be filed. 5 appeals were lost because the legal arguments were insufficient. and the question of who bears responsibility for that strategic direction, who pointed Harry toward those courtrooms and told him this was the way forward, is one that deserves considerably more scrutiny than it has received. The Sussex legal strategy has been by any objective measure a disaster, not a partial failure, not a mixed result, a comprehensive, repeated, documented disaster, and yet it continues. Maury cases, Maury appeals, Maury courtroom appearances in a country that Harry has publicly described as unsafe for his family. Unsafe, apparently, except when there are legal proceedings to attend. At which point the security concerns become, shall we say, manageable. Now I want to spend some time on something that I think is genuinely underexplored in the coverage of this situation, and that is the question of Meghan Markle's relationship with truth, not in the crude sense of calling her a liar. That's too simple and frankly too easy. What I'm interested in is something more sophisticated, something more revealing. Meghan Markle has a remarkable relationship with her own narrative. She is in the truest sense the author of her own story. And like all authors, she makes choices about what to include, what to omit, what to emphasize, and what to allow to fade into the background. Consider the autobiography she has constructed over the years, the biracial girl who struggled with identity. The actress who faced barriers in Hollywood, the woman who was welcomed into a royal family and then systematically mistreated, the mother protecting her children from institutional racism, the humanitarian working tirelessly for causes she believes in. It is, taken as a whole, a genuinely compelling narrative, the kind of story that resonates, the kind of story that makes people want to believe. But here is the problem with authored narratives. Other people were present. Other people have memories. Other people kept records. The story of Kate making Meghan cry before the wedding, contradicted by those who were in the room. The story of being secretly married 3 days before the official ceremony, clarified by the Archbishop of Canterbury himself, who confirmed that the private exchange of vows was not a legal marriage. The story of being denied mental health support by the institution, contradicted by former royal staff members who described extensive support structures being made available. None of these contradictions are trivial. Each one touches a central pillar of the victim narrative, and yet each one was deployed on global television, before audiences of tens of millions, with absolute conviction and extraordinary emotional force. There is a particular kind of courage required to make claims you know may not withstand scrutiny, in front of the largest possible audience, knowing that the emotional impact will outlast any subsequent correction. Because corrections never trend the way accusations do. Contradictions never get the airtime that original claims receive. The story lands, the nuance gets lost. The gap between them, a narrative is built that proves almost impossible to dislodge. If this sounds like a sophisticated media strategy to you, that is because it is a sophisticated media strategy. Executed with precision, executed with timing, executed, it should be noted, by a woman who spent years in the entertainment industry learning exactly how stories are told, how audiences are moved, and how perception becomes reality. The MPs calling for the removal of Sussex titles are not, as some would have you believe, a fringe element. They represent a broader sentiment that has been building in British public life for years, and which has now reached the point where elected representatives feel both entitled and obligated to give it voice. What is that sentiment? Precisely, it is the sentiment of a people who feel that they have been taken advantage of, that an institution they hold dear has been used as a launching pad for a commercial enterprise, and then attacked when it declined to be used further. That the goodwill of an entire nation was accepted, monetized, and then characterized as insufficient, racist, and cruel. There is something particularly galling to the British temperament about this sequence of events. The British are culturally a people who value understatement, discretion, and the quiet endurance of difficulty. They are not, as a general rule, a people who respond well to public emotional performance, to the broadcasting of private grievances, or to the explicit monetization of personal suffering. And what the Sussexes have offered from the very beginning is the opposite of all of those things. Maximalist emotional performance. public broadcasting of the most private family tensions, the explicit, unambiguous commercial exploitation of royal status and personal pain. To a British audience of a certain age and disposition, and let's be honest about who watches programs like this one, it has been somewhere between irritating and genuinely offensive. But beyond the cultural friction, there is a constitutional argument that is slowly gaining ground and that deserves serious consideration. Royal titles in the British system are not honorary. They are not merely decorative. They carry constitutional weight, legal implications, and institutional responsibilities. A duke is not simply a person with a fancy title. A duke occupies a specific position in the constitutional order of the United Kingdom. And that position carries obligations to the crown, to the institution, and to the people that institution serves. When a duke uses his title to negotiate Netflix deals while simultaneously undermining the institution that granted it, something has gone fundamentally wrong. Not just ethically, constitutionally. The mechanism is being used in a way it was never designed to function, and the people responsible for maintaining that mechanism are beginning to notice. The Titles Deprivation Act, the parliamentary motions, the public debate, these are not attacks on Harry and Meghan. They are the constitutional system doing what constitutional systems do when they are subjected to stress. They are correcting, they are adjusting, they are restoring equilibrium. And if the Sussexes find that uncomfortable, they might reflect on the fact that the discomfort is largely of their own making here. Is something I want you to consider about the business of being Meghan Markle. It requires an extraordinary amount of content. Not content in the casual sense, content in the industrial sense. A continuous, relentless supply of material, stories, grievances, revelations, reinventions fed into the machine of public attention to keep the brand visible and the commercial proposition alive. In the beginning, the content was royal. The wedding, the pregnancy, the official engagements, the fashion, the causes. The content practically generated itself because the royal family is, by definition, endlessly fascinating to a global audience. Then the royal content ran out. Not because the stories were exhausted, but because the source of the stories, the institution itself, became unavailable. The doors closed, the access ended. The invitations stopped arriving, and so new content was required. And the only remaining content of sufficient quality, sufficient resonance, sufficient commercial value to sustain the brand was grievance. Personal history, family conflict, institutional betrayal. The Oprah interview was not just a television program. It was a content strategy. The Netflix documentary was not just a personal story. It was an asset class. The memoir was not just a book, it was a quarterly earnings report. Every revelation, every accusation, every tear shed in front of a camera, every quiet moment of apparent vulnerability carefully framed and lit and released to the media, all of it is content. All of it feeds the machine. All of it sustains the brand, and the brand requires, above all else, a villain. A story without a villain is not commercially viable. A victim without a persecutor has no narrative tension. And so the royal family, the British press, the British establishment, the British public itself must be cast and maintained in the role of antagonist. The moment the villain is rehabilitated, the moment peace breaks out, the moment Harry reconciles with his family and the story of persecution loses its plausibility, the content dries up, the machine stops, the brand collapses. This is why every attempt at reconciliation has, mysteriously, ended in a new escalation. This is why every olive branch extended from the palace has been met, not with acceptance, but with a new interview, a new revelation, a new chapter of the autobiography that positions the peace offering as further evidence of bad faith. The conflict is not a byproduct of the business. The conflict is the business. I want to pause here and say something that might surprise you, given everything I've said so far. I feel sorry for Harry, not in a patronizing way, not in a way that diminishes his agency or his responsibility for his own choices, but in the way that you feel sorry for anyone who has been comprehensively outmaneuvered by someone far more strategically sophisticated than themselves. Harry is not a stupid man, but he is an emotionally driven man. He is a man shaped by the most profound maternal loss imaginable, endured in the most public circumstances imaginable, at an age when the psychological damage of such a loss cuts deepest. He is a man who grew up inside an institution that did not, by its own admission, always handle his well-being with the care it deserved. He is a man who was, by every account, desperately lonely in the years before he met Meghan, and desperately grateful when someone finally arrived who seemed to see him completely. That gratitude, that relief, that finally someone understands me, it is the most human thing in this entire inhuman story. And it is precisely the vulnerability that was found and used, because the cruelest con is always the one that starts with genuine feeling. The most effective trap is always the one that looks, at the beginning, like rescue. Harry was not rescued. Harry was recruited, and the British people who remember the young man who walked behind his mother's coffin, who served 2 tours in Afghanistan, who championed mental health awareness before it was fashionable, who threw himself into charitable work with evident sincerity, those people are watching what has been done to him and they are angry, not at Harry. At the person who did this to him. The parliamentary debate about the Sussex titles is going to intensify. I say this not as a prediction, but as a logical consequence of the dynamics currently in play. The legal defeats will continue to generate coverage that undermines the victim narrative. The business ventures will continue to underperform relative to their stated ambitions, eroding the financial foundation of the Sussex operation. The British public will continue to harden in its view, as each new content offering from Montecito confirms the impression that commercial calculation, not principle, is driving the Sussex machine. And at some point, I cannot tell you exactly when, but I can tell you it is coming, the political calculus in Westminster will shift to the point where action on the title question becomes not just possible but necessary. Because this is the thing about British institutions that outsiders consistently underestimate. They are slow, they are deliberate, they prefer inaction to precipitous action. But when they move with the full weight of centuries of accumulated authority. The monarchy has outlasted every challenge it has ever faced. It outlasted the Reformation. It outlasted the Civil War. It outlasted 2 world wars, an abdication, a constitutional crisis, and the death of the most beloved royal figure of the modern era. It will outlast this. The question is not whether the institution survives. The institution will survive. The question is what it looks like on the other side, and who is still carrying a title when the dust settles. There is a scene I keep returning to in my mind. Not a real scene, an imagined one. But imagined with enough specificity that it feels almost like memory. It is sometime in the future, not the distant future, the near future. And Harry is sitting somewhere quiet, perhaps in England, perhaps not, and he is reading something, perhaps a newspaper. Perhaps a court document, perhaps nothing. Perhaps he is just sitting, and in that silence something clarifies, not dramatically, not with the sudden violence of an epiphany, but slowly, the way the English winter light changes in the late afternoon, gradually, inexorably. And what clarifies is the distance between what he was told this would look like and what it actually looks like. He was told it would look like freedom, it looks like litigation. He was told it would look like peace. It looks like conflict. He was told it would look like love. It looks from the outside like strategy. And in that quiet room with that slow clarifying light, perhaps he begins to understand something that the rest of us figured out some time ago, that the people who needed to be escaped from were not in London, that the institution that needed to be left behind was not the royal family, that the prison was not Kensington Palace. And by the time he understood it, the door had been locked from the inside. 5 appeals, all denied. The pattern is clear and the message is unambiguous. But beyond the legal scoreboard, beyond the parliamentary debate, beyond the brand failures and the content strategies and the title questions and the constitutional implications, beyond all of it, this is a story about a woman who looked at an entire country's inheritance and decided it was hers to take, not to join, not to serve. Not to contribute to take. She took the titles. She took the access. She took the credibility. She took the man. And when the institution that provided all of those things asked for something in return, not much, just the ordinary performance of royal duty that every other member of the family manages without complaint, she decided that the asking was persecution and the expectation was cruelty. And she found in Harry someone who could be persuaded to believe it. That is the story. That is the whole story. Everything else, the lawsuits, the Netflix deals, the parliamentary motions, the appeals, the jam, the podcasts, the lifestyle brand, the opera interview, the memoir, all of it is footnote. The story is a woman who saw an opportunity and took it. And a country that is only now, after years of confusion and courtesy and characteristic British restraint, beginning to say out loud what it has known for a very long time. It is not, as it is sometimes portrayed, a relationship of blind deference. The British public is not a collection of capped-offing subjects who accept royal behaviour uncritically because the institution demands it. The history of the British monarchy is, in significant part, a history of the public refusing to accept royal behaviour that it finds unacceptable. Edward VII learned this. The public, through its elected representatives and its press, made abundantly clear that a king who prioritized his personal romantic preferences over his constitutional duties was not a king it wished to keep. He went, Princess Margaret learned it, in a different and more painful way. The public watched her struggles with a mixture of sympathy and judgment, and history has not been entirely kind to the choices she made. Even Diana, beloved, mourned, genuinely adored, was not immune to public scrutiny of her behavior. The private interviews, the panorama appearance, the deliberate manipulation of press coverage, all of it was watched and all of it was noted, even as the grief at her death was absolutely real and absolutely profound. The British public has always watched. It has always assessed. It has always eventually rendered its judgment. And right now it is rendering one. The judgment is not about Harry, not primarily. The British public retains, beneath the frustration, a residual tenderness for Harry that speaks to the depth of the connection he once had with the nation, the grief they shared at Diana's funeral, the warmth of his public appearances, the genuine bravery of his military service. These things are not forgotten. The judgment is about the woman who arrived in his life and the extraordinary transformation that followed her arrival. The judgment is about what was done, how it was done, and who benefited. Let us construct a timeline. Not of events, the events are well documented, but of a methodology. Because what has happened to Harry over the past 6 years has a structure, it has a logic. And when you map that logic carefully, what emerges is not chaos. What emerges is a pattern of such consistency and such strategic coherence that the word accidental becomes very difficult to sustain. Meghan Markle met Prince Harry in 2016. At that point, Harry was 31 years old, emotionally adrift, professionally undefined beyond his royal duties, and by his own subsequent admission, profoundly lonely. He had exited a long-term relationship. He was living in Kensington Palace in close proximity to his brother's growing family, a circumstance that, for a man without his own family unit, carried its own particular emotional weight. He was, in the language of vulnerability assessments, an ideal candidate for rapid, intense attachment. He was ready to be found, and he was found. The relationship moved with a speed that at the time seemed romantic and now, viewed through the lens of everything that followed, seems more deliberate. Within weeks it was serious. Within months it was public. Within a year and a half they were engaged. Within 2 years married. At each stage of this acceleration something else was happening. Something quieter, something that was easy to miss in the general excitement of a royal romance. Harry was being separated, not dramatically, not suddenly, but gradually, methodically, from the institutional and personal relationships that had previously anchored him. His friendships from before the relationship, several of them notably, did not survive the transition. His relationship with his brother, which had been by all accounts genuinely close, began to deteriorate in ways that multiple sources traced to this period. His relationship with palace staff, with the institutional structures that had supported him throughout his adult life, became strained to the point of rupture. And through each of these separations, there was a consistent explanatory framework being offered. The friends were not true friends. The brother was not truly supportive. Institution was not genuinely caring. The palace was not a home but a cage. Every severance was reframed as liberation. Every loss was presented as escape. Every closed door was described as a door that should have been closed long ago. This is not love. This is architecture. And the building being constructed, brick by careful brick, was a world in which Harry had one remaining source of emotional support, one remaining relationship of trust, one remaining person who truly understood him. The architect knew exactly what she was building. The question is whether Harry has yet begun to understand what he is living inside now, the legal dimension. 5 appeals, all denied. I want to approach this from a slightly different angle than most commentators have, because I think the most revealing aspect of the legal saga is not the outcomes but the strategy. Harry's litigation against the British press has been, from the beginning, framed as a matter of principle. He is fighting, we are told, not for himself but for everyone, not for personal vindication but for accountability, not for money but for justice. This is a noble framing. And noble framings, delivered with sufficient conviction, are difficult to challenge without appearing churlish. But let us examine the practical effects of the litigation strategy, because practical effects are considerably harder to obscure than stated intentions. The practical effect of Harry's ongoing legal battles with the British press is that he remains in a state of permanent conflict with British media institutions. This conflict generates continuous coverage. That coverage, regardless of its tone, keeps the Sussex names in circulation. In the attention economy, there is no such thing as bad publicity in the crude sense. There is only visibility and invisibility, and the litigation ensures visibility. The practical effect of Harry's courtroom appearances in Britain is that they create a narrative of a man so committed to justice that he personally returns to a country he has described as hostile to him, to pursue accountability through legit legal channels. This narrative is useful. It positions Harry as brave rather than litigious, principled rather than obsessive. The practical effect of the denied appeals is more complex, because legal defeats are not obviously useful. Unless, and this is the strategic calculation worth examining, unless the defeats are themselves content. Unless the story of a man fighting a rigged system and losing is more commercially and narratively valuable than the story of a man fighting a rigged system and winning. A victory ends the story, a defeat extends it. A denied appeal is another chapter, another grievance, another piece of evidence that the forces of darkness are aligned against the brave Duke and his remarkable wife. I am not suggesting the litigation was designed to fail. I am suggesting that the failure has been absorbed into the narrative with suspicious smoothness, that the losses have been repackaged with suspicious efficiency, that 5 consecutive legal defeats in the hands of a less sophisticated communications operation would represent a crisis, but in the hands of this particular operation have become content. The parliamentary calls for title removal deserve extended examination, because they represent something genuinely new in this story. For years, the political class in Britain largely kept its distance from the Sussex saga. Individual MPs might make the occasional comment, the odd backbencher might raise a question, but as an institutional matter, Parliament maintained a deliberate separation from what it regarded, however frustratingly, as a family matter. That separation has ended, and what ended it was not a single dramatic event. What ended it was accumulation. Slow, steady, relentless accumulation of behavior that made the position of dignified parliamentary silence increasingly untenable. When the opera interview aired, Parliament could reasonably say, "This is a family dispute, not our business." When the Netflix documentary was released, Parliament could reasonably say, "This is a commercial matter, not our concern." When the memoir was published, Parliament could reasonably say, "This is an individual's right to tell their story, not our place to intervene." But at some point, and that point has now been reached, the accumulation becomes a pattern. The pattern becomes a policy. And a policy of systematically using royal titles to generate commercial revenue, while simultaneously attacking the institution that granted those titles, is not in fact a family matter. It is a constitutional matter, and Parliament is a constitutional institution. The MPs now calling for title removal are not acting out of malice. They are not, whatever the Sussex communications team might suggest, acting out of racism or political opportunism or establishment protectionism. They are acting out of the recognition that a line has been crossed and that no one else is positioned to draw it. The king cannot publicly strip his son's titles without the political and constitutional fallout being catastrophic for the institution. The courts cannot remove titles, that is not their jurisdiction. The press can demand it until the newsprint runs out, but press demands do not remove titles. Only Parliament, acting through the mechanisms that Parliament possesses, can create the political conditions under which title removal becomes a practical reality. And Parliament is now, slowly but unmistakably, moving in that direction. I want to talk about the money, because the money is always revealing, and in this case, it is extraordinarily revealing. The Sussex commercial operation has, since its inception, been presented as a mission-driven enterprise. The podcast deal with Spotify, reportedly worth somewhere in the region of $18 to $20 million, was described in terms of storytelling, of amplifying voices, of creating content that matters. The Netflix deal, reportedly worth somewhere north of $100 million, was framed in terms of authentic storytelling, of content that reflects genuine values, of the Sussex desire to make a meaningful contribution to global culture. The book deals, the speaking engagements, the brand partnerships, the charitable foundations, all of it presented through the lens of purpose, of meaning, of two people using their platform for good, and then reality intervened. As it has a habit of doing, the Spotify deal produced one series of a podcast that, by industry metrics, underperformed significantly relative to comparable offerings. When the deal ended, reportedly at Spotify's instigation, not the Sussexes, a senior industry figure deployed that word again. Grifters. The Netflix deal produced a documentary series that performed reasonably in its opening week, as Netflix content tends to do when promoted aggressively, and then faded. The follow-up content, the individual projects that were supposed to demonstrate the range and depth of the Sussex creative vision, has emerged with a slowness that suggests either perfectionism or difficulty, and possibly both. The broader commercial portfolio has been characterized by announcements that don't translate into products, partnerships that don't translate into output, and initiatives that arrive with substantial fanfare and then quietly disappear. The lifestyle brand American Riviera Orchard arrived with a carefully orchestrated social media rollout, celebrity recipients of branded jams, breathless coverage in the press, and then not a great deal. The products have been slow to market. The commercial infrastructure has been slow to materialize. The business that was announced with such confidence has proceeded with such caution that the gap between the promise and the reality has become itself a story. This pattern of announcement without delivery, of promise without product, of brand without substance, is not new. It has characterized the Sussex commercial operation from the beginning, and it raises a question that the business press has begun to ask with increasing directness. What precisely is being sold? And is there actually anything behind the packaging? There is a concept in psychology called the grandiosity gap. It describes the space between the inflated self-image that certain personality types project and the reality that their actual achievements represent. The gap is maintained in the short term by the projection of confidence, by the cultivation of an image so carefully managed that the gap is not visible from the outside, but gaps have a way of becoming visible, especially when they are very large, especially when they are maintained in the full glare of global attention. Especially when every new venture, every new announcement, every new chapter in the public narrative provides a fresh opportunity for the reality to contradict the image. I am not diagnosing anyone. I want to be absolutely clear about that. I am a commentator, not a clinician, and the application of psychological concepts to public figures without professional assessment is a practice I approach with considerable caution, but I am allowed to observe. And what I observe is a persistent, widening gap between what is claimed and what is delivered, between the image constructed and the reality documented, between the narrative of a powerful, purposeful, globally significant enterprise and the evidence of missed targets, failed partnerships, and undelivered promises. The question the British public is now asking, quietly in the way that the British public asks its most serious questions, is whether it was ever real. Whether the confidence was ever grounded in substance. Whether the extraordinary positioning of the Sussex brand as a world-changing force for good was a vision or a sales pitch. And the evidence, accumulated over 6 years of watching, is pointing with uncomfortable consistency in one direction. Here is the thing about Harry's return to Britain that I find most poignant, and I use that word carefully and deliberately. He keeps coming back, despite the security dispute, despite the legal battles,